Elon Musk going after Trump and the Republicans in a way that could really matter beyond just tweeting or talking. He is vowing to now begin a new political party that would compete with the Republican Party. He says he'll call it the America Party. This Musk announcement comes amidst the break with Trump over the Republican budget, slashing subsidies, including things that Musk wanted that benefit his companies. Trump lashing out further. So the feud that had died down is back this week, saying Musk is off the rails and a train wreck.
I think it's ridiculous to start a third party. Third parties have never worked, so he can have fun with it, but I think it's ridiculous.
I'm back with Mark and Juanita. And Mark, we live in the world as it is and not as it might be. We were just discussing the power of some of these corporations that want to help Trump. Here is someone who has a level of wealth that can dwarf most congressional races. Can meaningfully be involved in the presidential race, as he showed last time. Trump says third parties don't work. Political scientists would tell you third parties have often tipped elections, even at the national level. Do you think if he spends on it, that this thing could matter or complicate the GOP's life?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that seems to be what Elon Musk's ideal reality would be here, which is to sort of disrupt what Republicans think, what they need to sort of win and continue to win the House majority and to keep the Senate. But I also think, a lot of the details here are key. I mean, Elon Musk has shown consistently that he's not really much of a detail guy as far as seeing something like this through. I mean, this is going to be requiring a lot of infrastructure, someone to recruit, candidates, get people on the ballot and so forth. I mean, that's a lot of sort of nitty gritty work, which obviously he didn't seem to be too big of a fan of before. So we'll see. I mean, I see why Trump would be ambivalent about it because, I mean, he probably stands to lose more. But I also think that, I have some serious doubts about Elon Musk's ability to actually execute something like this, given his relatively brief and somewhat tumultuous record in politics.
Yeah, I mean, he's a complex figure in that way, Juanita. You can't doubt that he's had impact. He's had huge impacts in fields that he's focused on. But unlike other people that sometimes put decades into something, he has this frenetic, almost ADD style of management. As a Politico yourself, I'm sure you can remind everyone, Juanita, how long-term party building usually takes multiple cycles. That's even if the Democrats are down a little bit and they're trying to fight back in Virginia or North Carolina, and that's a party people are registered in. Here you're asking for a whole new thing.
Not only are you asking for a whole new thing, it goes down to a granular level of hoops that he would have to jump through at the state and local levels in terms of petitions signed by local voters, engagement that's sustained. Candidates would be willing to run under his banner even, and then you bring in the entire concept of the federal election commissions and legal responsibilities and requirements and filings. I don't think he has the stomach for the long game, as Mark mentioned. But also, Ari, I got to jump back to something we talked about last time I was on with Jason Johnson, when he's like, why is a billionaire able to even influence elections this way? It does hearken to the devastating state of our democracy at present and how much farther it stands to decline if someone like Elon Musk continues to throw around his wealth and his billions in this game, when the reality is that real people's lives and well-being are on the line with every single election.
Yeah, Mark, how about that? I mean, we live our lives mostly through stories, not statistics. If the story becomes enough billionaires that are overreaching and upsetting to enough people, does that catalyze some concern that Juanita mentions? That a heck of a lot of people left, right, and center don't think other people, whether they made a lot of money or moved here from wherever, should be running everything just because they're rich.
You would think. I mean, I do think, look, I mean, it's unclear how much money, if any, Elon Musk is going to put into this. I mean, right now, his big interest, or at least his big success, has been to trigger Donald Trump. I mean, Donald Trump obviously doesn't like that he's doing this. And I think Elon Musk probably, is getting a kick out of that fact alone. Look, I think people don't like rich, billionaires getting involved in politics, but it's never stopped them before. It certainly didn't stop them in the last election. And there's really not been an election where you can point to money in politics sort of being the main issue. I mean, yes, John McCain has, that was sort of his signature when he first started running, his fundraising reform bill, which was a huge issue, but it hasn't really gotten traction, certainly not since the Supreme Court ruled, in favor of just super PACs and the unlimited money being allowed to be spent on campaigns. So, look, right now, I mean, I think it's sort of a distraction, and it's also hard to imagine a serious politician running in congressional district X on the America Party because he or she is very, very compelled by Elon Musk's vision for the future. I mean, I don't see it, but I guess it could happen in the next year and a half sometime.
We're going to have several announcements in the next 48 hours. And, Joe, I think what President Trump is concerned about is the quality of the deals, not the quantity. My mailbox was full last night with a lot of new offers, a lot of new proposals. So it's going to be a busy couple of days. But importantly, too, that President Trump has said that the countries would not go back to the reciprocal rate until August 1st.
Hi again, everybody. It's now 5 o'clock in the East with the 90 deals in 90 days deadline just 2 days from right now. Donald Trump's officials have moved the goalposts with a new message, new spin, a new August 1st deadline for those 90 deals in, well, not 90 days anymore. Just this afternoon, White House Press Secretary Karoline Leavitt confirmed that Donald Trump will make that change official with an executive order. The shifting timelines are leaving many of America's trade partners with more questions than answers. But there is one thing that is abundantly clear. Donald Trump thinks the tariff game is just that, a game, and that it looks good on him. As one White House insider tells Politico, quote, Trump knows the most interesting part of his presidency is the tariff conversation. It's all fake. There is no deadline. It's a self-imposed landmark in his theatrical show, and that's where we are, end quote. Keep that in mind, business owners far and wide. It's a joke. It's all for show. Trump is abruptly re-escalating his man-made trade war today, sending letters to at least 14 countries, setting tariff rates between 25% and 40%. They'll go into effect on that new August 1st deadline, absent any more moving of the goalposts or deals. Those countries include top U.S. allies like Japan and South Korea. Why all of this is now been reported to be a, quote, game to Donald Trump, there are very real consequences to the volatile nature of his on-again, off-again tariffs. With the renewed tensions today, stocks fell 1%. The Dow sank roughly 400 points. Now, an extra few weeks could perhaps produce a few more deals than the current partial ones that exist with the UK and Vietnam. But as the New York Times reports today, quote, with tariffs threatening to strain diplomatic relations and bring some global commerce to a halt, a delay of a few weeks may not do much to soothe many foreign governments. It could also further unsettle financial markets, which revolted when Trump initially announced his global tariffs, a meltdown that prompted Trump to institute the 90-day delay. They add this, quote, his tactics have stripped businesses of the certainty they need to plan, resulting in higher prices, less investment, and slower economic growth for the country. That is where we start the hour. Some of our favorite experts and friends, U.S. financial commentator for the Financial Times and writer of the Unhedged newsletter, Robert Armstrong, is back. Also joining us, CNBC's senior Washington correspondent, Eamon Javers, and NBC News White House correspondent, Vaughn Hilliard. Vaughn, we'll start with you in that I guess it goes in the category of shocking but not surprising reporting in Politico that to Donald Trump, the tariffs are, quote, a game.
I think that if you look back at these last months here, Nicole, I would go to Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent back in March when there was dispute within this White House about whether these tariffs were a negotiating tactic to use as leverage to force countries to come to the trading negotiating table, or whether these tariffs were permanent and here to stay. It depended if you talked to Peter Navarro, Howard Lutnick, or Scott Bessent, or even the president himself, who at one point said that they can be both. They can both be permanent tariffs and they can also be negotiating tools. And it was that comment from Scott Bessent back in March in which he said, quote, look, it's not linear, it's an organic process. And here on July 7, 2025. We are still very much living that in real time. I actually just, on my way out to talk to you, Nicole, about 5 minutes ago, ran into Peter Navarro, who was the very first one that folks may recall that threw out the idea that there would be 90 deals in 90 days. That statement was made after, on April 9th, this administration paused those, what they call reciprocal tariffs, those high tariff rates. And he effectively pledged and promised that there would be 90 deals that would come to fruition. Well, we haven't seen that happen. Maybe two countries have built somewhat frameworks of partial trade agreements, but we are far from those 90 deals in 90 days. And I was very specific with Navarro, and I asked him why there haven't been those 90 deals in 90 days. And he told me, quote, because the rest of the countries have it so good. They're dragging their heels. My follow-up question to him was on August 1st, why should countries take the U.S. seriously that they are actually going to implement those tariffs and not just shove them down the line again if, for example, the stock market falls? And he told me, quote, it doesn't matter from the sense that we're collecting billions of dollars on behalf of the American public. I think this is a live ball here at this White House as we watch these new deadlines come into fruition.
Eamon, I buy enough stuff for kids that I'm getting the emails about tariff price increases. And I want to ask you about consumers. And I have never heard Peter Navarro frame what he just described as basically a game and money pouring into the country in any language that helps American consumers. Where are they in all of this?
Yeah, look, I mean, it's a real concern for American consumers as to whether or not prices are going to really skyrocket if the president follows through on these tariffs that he is announcing today, right? So step back and look at what a tariff actually is. A lot of people still, don't understand this. What a tariff is it's a tax on American importers. So American companies that are importing goods from overseas pay that tax whenever the goods cross the border to Customs and Border Protection, right? So the president likes to talk about this as we're charging Canada, we're charging Vietnam. No, what a tariff does is it charges the American company that's importing. Now, that American company has a choice, right? It can try to lower its prices by negotiating with its suppliers in Vietnam or China, see if they can get a better deal from those guys, or raising prices for consumers and passing that tariff cost on to consumers. What they're not going to want to do is lower their own profitability and have to answer to their shareholders about why they're making less money this quarter than they made last quarter. That's never where a CEO wants to be. So generally speaking, they're either going to try to get it from the suppliers or they're going to have to get it from the consumers, and that means prices are going to go up to some degree. Maybe not 100% of the tariff cost, but to some degree that those prices are going to get passed on.
And Eamon, just speak to the uncertainty. What does that do?
For CEOs, this is really difficult, right? Because they've spent 6 months now watching tariff rates going up, going down, being put on pause. You have a 90-day deadline, then the deadline comes and we're extending another month. They don't know what to make of this. They don't know where this ball is going to land, and so they can't plan. And so what you've seen is overall sort of a slowdown of economic confidence. You see that in a lack of hiring. You see that in a whole host of statistics as CEOs kind of tread water here and look to see, what might be coming next. The stock market is doing really well. We did see a jobs number that was good. So, across the board, you're seeing good economic numbers, but it's in a context where it's very difficult for CEOs to plan, to expand, to grow, to do all the things they want to do. So they're caught betwixt and between. And if these tariffs stay at this high rate that the president's announcing country by country today, some of that you'd have to imagine is going to have to get passed on to consumers, and they'll take a hit in the wallet.
So, Robert, you coined taco, and I know not in a derisive manner, that it was, in your view, right? Trump was deeply offended, insulted, feathers ruffled, all the words. But you didn't mean it in a derogatory way. And some of what Eamon's describing about the health of the markets is reflected in the term you coined, Trump always chickens out.
Correct. And I think, from my perspective, which is the perspective of somebody who believes in globalism and believes in trade as a source of strength from the United States, when Trump pushes these deadlines back, it's absolutely right as Eamon pointed out, that this has some bad effects on confidence and so forth. But I prefer that alternative to the world in which the worst of Trump's policy ideas actually go into effect. What we don't want is a mercantilist, anti-global, poorer United States. So I'd prefer clear policy, but I like unclear policy better than I like bad policy.
So, Robert, just explain to me then that what the market's reacting the positive reaction in the markets is basically Trump's policy impotence and political lack of will.
Yeah, I mean, I think what the market is saying is that these policies won't add up to much when push comes to shove. And it's very important, even as we've seen announcements about countries like Vietnam and today about Japan and Korea. These are more like frameworks than actual deals. And it's very clear that room remains for negotiation. And so there's room for the markets to remain skeptical of Trump. The push will only come to shove, Nicole, when the markets see a trade deal they believe is going to stick. The markets have a chance to respond to that. And then Trump has a chance to respond to the markets. Then we see if he's going to chicken out or not. Right now, it's all preliminaries. The game really hasn't begun yet.
So, Tony, tell me about why so many people, what's the going theory right now about why so many people did not move when they got that alert? Is it that a lot of them just didn't get it? Why were there so many people that ended up getting swept away by these floodwaters?
And Katie, that's one of the things that we are really trying to determine and have been trying to determine since this tragedy struck. There are a number of different factors that are in play here, and there may not be one single answer that speaks to all of the factors at play. But number one, we are being told by officials in Kerr County and people who were there when this flash flood struck, and that is potentially they may have been in an area that did not have cell phone reception. Keep in mind, this is a deeply rural area with a lot of rolling hills that may impact the ability for people to receive those alerts on their phone. But at the same time, officials and experts who work in emergency management also note that people potentially could have or should have had NOAA weather radios and whether or not those radios were turned on. And I think in the weeks and the months to come, there's going to be a lot of attention on camp operators and what they may have known or what plans they may have had in place to evacuate their properties or to move campers to higher ground for situations exactly like this.
Yeah, the good thing about those NOAA radios, and I just discussed this with a former NOAA official and a guy at the National Severe Storms Lab, they just turn on. If you have them programmed to the frequency in your area, and they just turn on automatically once that button is pushed at headquarters saying that there is a flash flood or there's a warning, a get out now alert in your area. So they are very effective. And they were, by the way, developed in the aftermath of a giant flood there in the 80s. Richard, I know you can speak to that better than I can. You were the 11th administrator of NOAA. When you were looking at this, and if you were still in charge, what would you be advising?
Yeah, heartbreaking as this is, I think it's pretty clear that these loss of life and the damaged property, a lot of it was ultimately preventable. And it has to do with the fact that the Weather Service did their job. They put the watches and warnings out that you heard about with 3 to 4 hours of lead time prior to the very severe flooding. But at the end of the day, it's about what we call the last mile. So the message goes out, the warning goes out using language like considerable and catastrophic impact. But if the emergency managers, the people with responsibility for evacuating people or at the very least notifying those who are going to be impacted, don't get the message, don't know how to respond, then you're going to have the kind of loss of life that we saw here. And quite honestly, one of the biggest challenges is that with an understaffed National Weather Service, some of the abilities to connect with the emergency management community have probably been compromised of late.
There's also an issue of trust. Have you seen a degradation of trust between people getting these alerts, Richard, and heeding these alerts?
I think a lot of times people feel like, well, I've had a false alarm in the past, I won't necessarily respond. But the key there is to make sure that we're getting information to folks that are trusted by local communities. So emergency managers and personnel who are part of the community are usually well trusted. So the connection between the National Weather Service and those emergency managers is critical to get past that inherent distrust about whether I need to evacuate or I should prepare for some major outcome.
So there are a lot of critiques right now and questions, and Democrats are calling for investigations into the Trump administration over the cuts that DOGE made to the National Weather Service, to NOAA, the ability to forecast and predict and then respond to these sorts of disasters, Peter. But there's also now questions about whether cutting FEMA is a good idea. Donald Trump wants to get rid of FEMA after this next hurricane season. And I read that op-ed in the New York Times from a former official over there laying out that you can't just get rid of it and leave it to the governors. It's not so easy as saying, hey, governors, take up this responsibility. NOAA recorded 27 events last year that cost the U.S. economy at least $1 billion. $1 billion. And to put that on the heads of individual states, which, by the way, have to balance their budgets and have to account for all sorts of other things, and then have those states then wait for federal funding later to come, if it does, it's pretty difficult. I wonder if anyone in the administration is reconsidering that today.
Yeah, it's a good question, Katie. I've been covering the White House now since the 90s. 5 presidents. I've traveled with all of them to disaster sites around the country, tornadoes, hurricanes, flash floods, wildfires, you name it. And every time a president lands in one of these disaster zones, what the governors tell him is they want more FEMA, not less. More FEMA, right? And this is Republican governors and Democratic governors. I've never heard a governor tell any president who was visiting a site of a national disaster, I want the federal government to do less. Now, they wanted to do better, no question about it. There are critiques of FEMA and how it has run things. As the op-ed talked about, there are people who have ideas for how it could be reformed and made more efficient. But the idea that they're going to pull back altogether seems a curious one, because I don't see a demand for that among the states. I don't hear a rising call from the states saying, hey, get rid of FEMA, let's not do this. And by the way, this is, again, bipartisan. When disasters happen, the first people in Congress to put in for money to help communities that have been hurt are Republicans as well as Democrats. You don't see any Republicans saying back, hey, don't give money to my community after you've had a terrible disaster. No, of course, they say the federal government has to step in because, in fact, it often is beyond the capacity of any individual community or state to handle some of these really big ticket disasters.
Does anybody in the administration feel free to make the argument that there is some federal funding for research for NOAA, for the National Weather Service, Peter, that is not wasteful, or is it too tied up with this GOP bugaboo of climate change?
Yeah, it's all associated with climate change. The people who want to do research like that are assumed to be, in Trump's kind of phrasing, climate ideologues and so forth. It's part of the broader attack on the deep state, the assumption that any federal agency is by definition corrupt and so forth. And it's ideological. There's a real strong ideological belief that research into weather patterns, that funding for climate science and climate exploration is automatically suspect and therefore, doesn't have support of this administration.
Richard, make the case for more funding, not less, for NOAA.
Well, the case is being made by the example of what we're seeing now. Is there benefit in having a better predictive capability for extreme weather events? We're going to see extreme heat waves. We're seeing tornadoes. Last year, we saw Hurricane Milton hit Florida and spawn tornadoes in a way we had never seen before. These storms are bigger, they have more power, they're moving differently. So consequently, our ability to predict them depends on making investments in fundamental research. And the president's budget, as proposed right now, eliminates, dare I say, obliterates all of NOAA research, which basically means that we have a guarantee that we will see no improvements to service from where we are right now.
Now, apparently, we're back in business. This one went up recently in Washington, also about 8 feet tall. It's really big. It shows Trump's signature thumbs up photo pose smashing down onto the crown of the Statue of Liberty. It says in bronze letters across the front, "Dictator approved." And then on the four sides of the base, it has 4 quotes from dictators, all praising Trump. There's a quote praising Trump from Vladimir Putin, one from Viktor Orban, one from Jair Bolsonaro, and one from Kim Jong-un. That dictator-approved one went up a few weeks ago in roughly the same place as the Pelosi desk poop statue. The White House was apparently very unhappy about this one. They put out a sort of sad, scoldy, petulant statement about it. They said, quote, "In the United States of America, you have the freedom to display your so-called art, no matter how ugly it is." They actually said that in a White House statement. The people who created that so-called art apparently heard that statement from the White House and thought, challenge accepted. Washingtonian Magazine got a comment from one of the anonymous organizers behind that piece of art, who told them that once the White House put out that statement, "You have the freedom to display your so-called art no matter how ugly it is." Once they heard that from the White House as an official White House statement, they decided they would meet the challenge. They would try to create, quote, "the ugliest art that we could think of." And so then they put up a new piece. And it actually has that full White House quote on a plaque. And that plaque is on yet another new sculpture, I think deliberately designed to be as ugly as possible. It's got a gold spray-painted ivy and a gold spray-painted eagle and a gold spray-painted TV. And in these images, it looks like the TV is off, but in situ, this sculpture actually has the TV playing stuff. The TV apparently is battery powered, and it runs a constant loop of video clips of Trump doing his signature dance where he looks like he's doing something rude with each hand. And these clips that play on a loop on this sculpture, they include a little squib of video of Trump kind of doing that dance at a party with the late millionaire pedophile Jeffrey Epstein, to whom President Donald Trump was in fact a friend. Because for our sins, with everything else going on, with Trump today restarting the total economic chaos of random scattershot tariffs on every country in the world other than Russia, with the U.S. government in its infinite wisdom under Donald Trump, getting us back into the measles business, which we had basically eradicated, but now we've got the biggest measles outbreak we've had in more than 30 years, with President Trump saying he was, quote, "not notified of the decision to cut off U.S. military support shipments to Ukraine." He said he was not notified and he issued no instruction to do that, raising the obvious question of, okay, then if you as president didn't make that decision, who made that decision? With Trump literally paving the Rose Garden and putting this picture of himself up in the White House in the room with all the portraits of the first ladies. I mean, this is what he put up, right? I mean, in the middle of everything else, large and small, that we are contending with, there really is a Jeffrey Epstein, Donald Trump subplot in our lives now, in which this footage exists and in which the Trump Justice Department put out a statement today saying, never mind all the things we ever said and hyped and screamed about the late pedophile Jeffrey Epstein. Turns out it's all nothing and people should stop asking us about it. Headline: Trump administration acknowledges lack of evidence from Epstein documents. After months of promising big revelations, Attorney General Pam Bondi acknowledges a lack of evidence for a host of conspiracy theories, including a, quote, client list. Trump's Attorney General Pam Bondi, in fact, not only said there was a Jeffrey Epstein client list that Trump had ordered her to review and release to the American people. She not only said there was a Jeffrey Epstein client list, she said that she had it in her possession on her desk.
One of the things that you alluded to, and this is something Donald Trump has talked about, the DOJ may be releasing the list of Jeffrey Epstein's clients. Will that really happen?
It's sitting on my desk right now to review. That's been a directive by President Trump. I'm reviewing that. I'm reviewing JFK files, MLK files. That's all in the process of being reviewed because that was done at the directive of the president from all of these agencies.
Oh, yes, it was a directive of the president. The Epstein client list is sitting on my desk right now, says Donald Trump's hand-picked attorney general. New statement today from her department, the U.S. Department of Justice, says there is no Epstein client list. The systematic review revealed no incriminating client list, according to today's DOJ memo. These guys have been hyping the whole Epstein conspiracy theory for years. I mean, this is the guy who Donald Trump appointed to be deputy director of the FBI.
I've already told you the Epstein story. Let's just say a friend who knows about something, if you've heard the story, was on the plane with Clinton with the Epstein thing, and he said, I'm out of here, Daddy-O. I told that story quite a few times, so I know a lot about this story. There are a lot of people who know old Jeff. A lot of people. So it's kind of weird, like this client list is about to come out. Everybody got quiet all of a sudden.
I know a lot about this story. A lot. Says the podcaster who Trump named to be deputy director of the FBI. Now today, knock, 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 FBI, what's up with that? Today, according to the FBI and the Justice Department, there is nothing at all to this Jeffrey Epstein story. Please stop talking about it. There will be no further information released. Client list, what client list? We will not be talking about this anymore. There will be no further information. You should stop talking about this, except maybe if it is raised, on the gold spray-painted television sculpture on the National Mall. Maybe you could learn something about it there, but otherwise, now that Donald Trump is the head of the U.S. federal government, we're just, no.
Joining us now to help fact-check the administration, former Maryland Governor Martin O'Malley. He served as the commissioner for the Social Security Administration during the Biden administration.
I promise we will get to the substance of the claims that are being made, but I just can't get over the fact that the Social Security Administration sent a blast email with what we can call a lot of misstatements, to be most generous. I don't remember receiving any emails from you.
No, you wouldn't have received those from me for a number of reasons. One of them is that we had an inspector general's office with a leader there who would have come down hard on me if I had done such a thing. And the other is we had career lawyers who would say, time out, you can't do that. When people signed up with their personal data for a MySSA account, they didn't sign up for political spam and in this case, I mean, it's just so... It is, brass balls or ovaries to see these same people that have worked so hard to damage the reputation of Social Security to now take our personal data and use it as a propaganda tool. It's appalling, and I'm sure people in the agency that are career people, it's a sad day for the agency they love.
I just, I'm sitting here and I'm thinking about, all the information that our seniors and individuals now coming into the system get. That application process is in and of itself, something that you have to navigate. And now they have the administration sort of on the back end, to your point, throw out this spam, this misinformation to seniors. What should American seniors know at this moment about what they get and what they don't get, how they're impacted under current policy, irrespective of what Donald Trump is out here telling them?
Right. As I visited Social Security reception areas all over the country, on those few occasions when people said to me, hey, I don't want to be paying taxes on my Social Security, when you started to peel back the onion, what they were actually talking about was the Medicare payments that are taken out of their Social Security. And you're going to see now, Governor, this huge number of people that now start calling the 1-800 number, which has such huge attrition rates and so many people quitting and leaving that they're now taking people out of the field offices and telling them they have to transfer to the 800 number. You're going to see people going into the Social Security offices because of this misleading statement that they now shouldn't be seeing any taxes taken out of their Social Security. And let's be clear about this. You know, when we sign up in that MySSA account, we're told only general communications would come to you. For example, when President Biden expanded to police, fires, and teachers, the difference in their benefits, that affected 3 million people, and the agency did email 3 million people, but it appears they emailed 64 million people, a much broader group for these propaganda purposes. It was done officially. It was done with the commissioner speaking in his official capacity, and it was factually incorrect, is going to drive up volume, is going to damage customer service, even more so than they already have by driving 7,000 people out of the agency.
I would like to put a finer point on it and say the Social Security Administrator lied when sending out that communication. Now, let me just say this. So on the campaign trail in 2024, Donald Trump said, I'm going to make sure that there are no taxes on Social Security. Never in any version of the bill that has now become law was there a provision that said there will be no taxes on Social Security in this bill. But Donald Trump has consistently said it anyway. I think he's saying it because he just wants to be able to say promises made, promises kept. Like, I said I was going to do it, and I told you I did it, so I did it. My question is this then. What are Democrats going to do? Is there a plan to cut some ads out there to say this is a lie? Because short of that, you have the largest bully pulpit available in America telling you one thing. The administrator of the Social Security Administrator, whom, if I'm on Social Security, why wouldn't I believe the administrator? Yeah. The administrator telling you the same thing the president is saying. How are folks who know this is a lie, Democrats especially, who would like to wrestle back power from this president and Republicans in Congress, how are you going to make sure that people know that this is a lie?
Well, I do think they've got, kind of too cute by half on this, because when seniors see their direct deposit or their checks and they see that there's still dollars being taken out of it, the Medicare dollars in particular, which is larger usually for, like I think 50% of seniors don't pay any taxes on Social Security to begin with, but they think they do because of the Medicare. So this is going to be a bit of a self-basting turkey from communication standpoint. It's going to cause...
But can I just say, and it's the commissioner, as you were the commissioner, not the administrator, but can I just say, what you just said sounds confusing. It sounds like, well, I don't understand then. What do they do? When the president is saying there's no tax on your Social Security benefits.
Can I tell you what I think might actually be more resonant with folks? The fact that we were already looking at 2033 for solvency, and the fact that now you're looking at 2032. I mean, because you framed this as seniors, but even mortgage millennials like myself like to think about the future of Social Security and whether or not it's going to be there for us to rely on.
And that was
taking it out my check.
And that was not mentioned in that email, was it? No mention of the fact that it advanced the depletion of the Social Security surplus by a year. Also did the same thing to Medicare. So there is no program that affects as many people as directly as Social Security does. I mean, yes, there's the post office, yes, there's the IRS, but so many people over 65 depend on that Social Security payment to be the difference between living with dignity or living under a bridge. So when they see, after hearing, this carnival barker, Donald Trump, who lies like other people chew bubble gum, say again and again and again, there's no taxes being taken out of your check. And then they see that it is, and then they wait for 3 hours in a depleted field office or wait for 2 hours on the 1-800 number. They're going to figure out the truth because it's going to be in the bottom line of their check and their direct deposit.
So to go a little bit deeper into Alicia's question for the generation that's now beginning to focus on what their retirement future looks like. You have the taxation of Social Security benefits starting back in like 1983, and that was to stabilize. And every time we turn around, everyone's talking about stabilizing Social Security. The numbers go down. Now we lose another year. It's going to be depleted.
Actually, it was pushed out under President Biden.
Well, no, it was pushed out, but I'm just saying that yo-yo is what I'm talking about. All right, so you have one administration that sort of advances Social Security a little bit further down the road, stabilize it into the future. You have another administration comes in, does some crazy stuff that sort of contracts that timeline. If you had the power and the authority, you've been inside that room, how do you stabilize Social Security going forward? What, regardless of partisan perspective, as someone who's actually run the agency, you know how to make the damn thing work.
Yeah, actually, the fix to the long-term financial stability of Social Security is actually a fairly simple thing. Right now, since 1983, and every 30, 40 years, Congress makes some adjustment, since at least 1983, there is a cap on dollars earned that actually pay any percentage into Social Security. And once anyone, and it's adjusted for inflation, but once any American or family of four reaches $170,000, they stop paying into Social Security, which means somebody that makes $170 million pays the same $10,000 into Social Security as that family of four that made $170,000. So the longer-term financial stability actually can be fixed. And the biggest part of that fix is to tell people in the income bracket of Donald Trump, Elon Musk, Warren Buffett, hey, guys, you need to keep paying into Social Security because it undergirds the very promise of America which is that no one who reaches their golden years should die in poverty, and no one who becomes disabled should have their children kicked to the curb and have to live under a bridge.
They're too busy using their disposable income to start third political parties.
Correct, and only one political party in this country at this moment seems to believe in what you just said, and it is not the Republican Party.
22 past the hour. As I mentioned earlier, the U.S. deported 8 men to South Sudan on Friday after the Supreme Court ruled in favor of the Trump administration's effort to deport migrants to third countries. The men from 6 different nations were held for weeks at an American military base before a federal judge denied a request from their lawyers to stop their relocation over fears of torture. U.S. administration officials said all 8 men had been convicted of serious crimes in the U.S. prior to their deportation. That comes, as Axios notes this morning, quote, the MAGA movement is reveling in the creativity, severity, and accelerating force of President Trump's historic immigration crackdown, and that once fringe tactics, an alligator-moated detention camp, deportations to war zones, denaturalization of immigrant citizens are now being proudly embraced at the highest levels of the U.S. government. The report continues, and it's an extraordinary shift from Trump's first term when nationwide backlash and the appearance of cruelty forced the administration to abandon its family separation policy for unauthorized immigrants. And now the newly signed spending law will provide the administration an influx of billions of dollars in new funding for immigration enforcement. Meanwhile, Joe Rogan is once again speaking out about President Donald Trump's immigration policies. During an episode of his podcast last week, Rogan criticized the president's immigration enforcement tactics that have seen nonviolent immigrants swept up in ICE raids.
We were told there would be well, there's 2 things that are insane. One is the targeting of migrant workers, not cartel members, not gang members, not drug dealers, just construction workers showing up in construction sites and raiding them, gardeners. Yeah. Like, really?
Rogan first criticized Trump's immigration policies earlier this year after a Venezuelan asylum seeker was deported to El Salvador despite having no gang affiliations. The co-host of MSNBC's The Weekend Prime Time, Elise Jordan, is back with us. Also joining us, opinion writer at The New York Times, Mara Gay. And Mara, I'm first of all wondering, I'm trying to think of the limits that might be pushed with this new funding coming in from the bill.
Limits. I think, unfortunately, what we're seeing is that these ICE raids have now, it's going to just be turbocharged and without any kind of accountability. Congress has not shown an appetite under Republican control for any kind of oversight. And we're talking about spending dollars for ICE and ICE raids and DHS that rival some countries, the entire budget of other countries. So there's a lot of concerns about just wantonness, I would say. We already don't actually have much insight at all into what's happening on America's streets, where these raids are happening, the way they're being conducted. And I think that Americans should be asking their Congress people to take a far more active role in oversight. And you know, I think there's just an underlying tragedy here. We were told for years, you know, I'm not even 40 years old. I remember being told there's no money in America for health care, for public education, for new parks, all kinds of initiatives that we were told there's no money for this. But suddenly there's money to deport farm workers. There's money to sweep up, you know, people who worked with our troops in Afghanistan. There's funding to separate families. People who have really not committed crimes, but have come here to work, to be a part of this country. And I just think that the cruelty underlying this really shows that this isn't about immigration policy for this White House. This is about a policy of othering people who are not seen as American enough. And I think that is chilling. And you see that through line with this Alcatraz. You know, it's so disturbing. It's honestly hard to get my
Mara, I do think you hit the nail on the
it.
head, though, talking about the cruelty.
Yeah.
You know, it sounds like the migrants who are being deported to South Sudan have committed some pretty unsavory crimes. That said, how is it within humanitarian law to send people to a war zone, to an active war zone? Mika, I just think it sounds insane, and I just can't believe we're doing this as a country.
Yep.